Elias Thornwell stood in his shirt sleeves inside the cabin while the blizzard outside dropped temperatures to 30 below zero, watching through his window as neighbors 300 yards away burned their furniture in a desperate attempt to stay alive. What separated his impossible warmth from their freezing desperation was a design so ridiculous that every trapper in the Montana Territory had called him insane for building it. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from, and if stories like this move you, hit that subscribe button because tomorrow's episode is even more unbelievable than this one. The year was 1838, and the Rocky Mountain fur trade was in its final golden years. Beaver pelts still commanded premium prices in eastern markets, and men willing to risk everything could make a small fortune in a single trapping season. But the risks were substantial and undeniable. Grizzly bears, harsh winters, accidents, and the simple, brutal mathematics of frontier survival killed trappers with consistent regularity. Most mountain men accepted these dangers as the unavoidable cost of freedom and profit. Elias Thornwell had survived 6 winters in the mountains, trapping beaver along the tributaries of the Yellowstone River in what would later become southwestern Montana. He was 32 years old, competent with traps and rifles, and careful in ways that had kept him alive when flashier men had died. He had partnered that season with a German immigrant named Martin Reichert, a methodical trapper who had come west 4 years earlier seeking the kind of independence that was impossible in the crowded cities of the eastern seaboard. They had established their winter camp in October of 1837 near the confluence of 2 creeks, surrounded by beaver ponds, and far enough from established trails to avoid unwanted attention from competing trappers or roving bands protecting their traditional hunting grounds. The location was ideal for their purposes. Dense stands of pine and spruce provided timber for construction and fuel. The creeks offered water and access to their trap lines. Game was abundant enough to supplement their provisions. Their cabin was typical of the era and of their practical needs. They had built it in 5 days, working together to notch logs at the corners and stack them into walls roughly 12 feet by 14 feet. They chinked the gaps between logs with moss and mud, built a simple door from split planks, cut one small window covered with stretched deer hide, and topped the structure with a roof of poles and bark. A basic stone fireplace in one corner provided heat and a place to cook. The dirt floor was hard-packed and cold, but it was level. The entire structure represented the minimum necessary shelter to survive a mountain winter, nothing more. It was adequate, or so they believed. The cabin kept out wind and rain. The fireplace drew properly and warmed the interior space. They had laid in sufficient supplies for the winter months when trapping was impossible, and their fall season had been productive enough to justify staying through until spring. By November, they had settled into the rhythm of winter survival. They checked trap lines when weather permitted, processed pelts, maintained their equipment, and spent long evenings in the cabin playing cards and talking about what they would do with their earnings when they returned to civilization. Neither man had any reason to suspect that their cabin, built exactly like hundreds of other mountain cabins across the Rockies, contained a fatal flaw that would soon become terrifyingly obvious. December brought the first serious cold. Temperatures dropped steadily through the month, and by the 3rd week, nighttime lows were reaching 20 below zero. Elias and Martin burned wood constantly, keeping the fireplace roaring from dawn until they banked it for sleep. The cabin stayed tolerably warm during the day, but at night, even with the fire built high, cold seeped through every gap in the chinked logs and radiated up from the frozen ground beneath their feet. On December 27, 1837, a storm moved in from the northwest. The temperature dropped to 35 below zero, colder than either man had experienced in the mountains. They burned wood at an unsustainable rate, feeding the fireplace every 30 minutes throughout the day and night. The interior temperature barely stayed above freezing despite their efforts. Frost formed on the interior walls. Their water bucket froze solid. Breathing hurt their lungs. Martin began showing signs of trouble on the 2nd day of extreme cold. He was shivering constantly, even sitting close to the fire. His speech became slow and slightly slurred. Elias recognized the early stages of severe cold exposure, but there was nothing to do except keep the fire burning and wait for the temperature to rise. They had no way to generate more heat. The fireplace was already operating at maximum capacity. By the third day, Martin was in serious condition. He had stopped shivering, which Elias knew was a dangerous sign. His skin was pale and cold to the touch. He was confused, insisting he felt warm when the cabin was clearly freezing. Elias wrapped him in every available blanket and fur, kept the fire roaring, and stayed awake through the night, feeding logs into the flames. It wasn't enough. The cabin simply could not retain heat. Every bit of warmth the fire produced escaped through the roof, through gaps in the chinked walls, through the thin door, through the deer-hide window covering, and through the dirt floor into the frozen ground below. The fireplace was fighting a losing battle against basic physics, and no amount of wood could change the equation. Martin Reichert died just before dawn on December 30th. He simply stopped breathing, his body unable to maintain core temperature despite being wrapped in furs and sitting 5 feet from a roaring fire. Elias sat beside his partner's body as morning light filtered through the deer-hide window, understanding with absolute clarity that Martin had not died from exposure in the wilderness. He had died inside a shelter specifically built to protect against the cold. The cabin had failed completely in its primary function. Elias buried Martin 2 days later when the temperature finally rose enough to make digging possible. He wrapped the body in blankets, carried it to a hillside overlooking the creek, and spent 6 hours breaking through frozen ground to create a grave. He marked it with stones and spoke no words. Words seemed inadequate to address what had happened. Elias stayed in the cabin alone through January of 1838, but he was no longer trapping, he was thinking. Every night he built the fire high and watched heat escape. He could see it happening now that he was paying attention. The warm air rose to the ceiling and disappeared through the bark and pole roof. Cold air leaked in through every seam in the walls and pooled on the floor. The fireplace consumed enormous quantities of wood and produced surprisingly little lasting warmth. He started measuring and calculating. He had a thermometer among his supplies, a mercury instrument he had brought west, more out of curiosity than necessity. He began taking readings at different locations inside the cabin. 5 feet from the fireplace, the temperature was comfortable, perhaps 60 degrees. 10 feet away, it dropped to 40. At floor level anywhere in the cabin, it was barely above freezing. Near the ceiling, it was warmer, but that heat was escaping through the roof instantly. The mathematics were brutal and undeniable. The cabin was losing heat faster than the fireplace could generate it. During extreme cold, the deficit became fatal. A man could burn every tree within a mile and still freeze to death inside a structure that was supposed to protect him. The cabin was not a shelter. It was a poorly insulated box that allowed heat to escape in every direction. Elias became obsessed with understanding why. He examined every aspect of the cabin's construction with new eyes. The logs were solid enough, but the gaps between them were substantial. The moss and mud chinking had dried and cracked, creating airways that allowed heat to flow out and cold to flow in. The roof was particularly problematic. Warm air rose naturally, and the bark and pole construction offered almost no resistance to heat escaping into the atmosphere. The door and window were obvious weak points, but even sealing them completely would not solve the fundamental problem. The problem was that the entire cabin was designed to be minimally adequate during moderate conditions. It had no margin for extreme weather. When temperatures dropped to life-threatening levels, the cabin's inadequacies became fatal. Martin had died because their shelter was built using the same techniques every other trapper used, techniques that prioritized speed of construction over thermal efficiency. Elias began asking himself a question that would consume the next year of his life. If fire alone could not keep a man warm, what could? The obvious answer was insulation, but what kind? How could a man build a structure that retained heat instead of bleeding it into the wilderness? He had seen buildings in Street Louis that stayed warm with relatively small fires. What did they have that his cabin lacked? The answer, he began to realize, was not better materials. It was better design, understanding how heat moved, and building structures that worked with physics rather than against it. February brought slightly warmer temperatures, and Elias forced himself to complete Martin's burial properly. He returned to the gravesite with tools to improve the stone marker and clear snow from the area. While working on the hillside, he noticed chickadees flitting through the pine trees, apparently unbothered by temperatures that had killed a grown man inside a heated cabin. He watched them with new attention. The birds were tiny, with almost no body mass to generate or retain heat. Yet they survived winter nights that dropped to 30 below zero. They had to be doing something that worked better than his cabin's design. Curiosity drove him to follow several birds until one disappeared into a hole in a dead pine tree about 15 feet above the ground. Elias cut down the tree carefully and split it open to examine the bird's nest cavity. What he found was instructive. The bird had not simply hollowed out a single chamber. The entrance hole led to a short tunnel that turned downward before opening into the nest cavity. Above the nest, the hollow continued upward in a chimney-like structure. The design was elaborate for something a bird had created, and it took Elias several minutes to understand the purpose. The tunnel entrance prevented wind from blowing directly into the nest. The downward turn meant cold air, which was heavy, would sink away from the sleeping area. The chimney above the nest created a dead air space that trapped warmth rising from the bird's body. The entire structure was designed to capture and hold heat in the nest chamber while preventing cold air from reaching it. The bird had engineered a passive thermal retention system using nothing but the natural properties of air and wood. Elias sat on the hillside holding pieces of the split tree and felt something shift in his understanding. The bird was not generating significant heat. Its body heat was minimal. But the nest structure multiplied the effectiveness of that small heat source by preventing loss. The key was not producing more warmth. The key was trapping the warmth that already existed. He thought about his cabin. The fireplace produced enormous heat, but the cabin's design allowed it all to escape. What if he could build a structure that trapped heat the way the bird's nest did? Not with a single insulated wall, but with spaces, chambers, layers of trapped air that would prevent heat from flowing away? The idea seemed absurd at first. A cabin was not a bird's nest. The scale was completely different, but the physics were the same. Warm air rose, cold air sank, still air insulated. Moving air carried heat away. If he could create multiple chambers of still air around his living space, each chamber would act as an insulating layer. He spent 3 days on the hillside, thinking and sketching rough diagrams in the snow with a stick. Other trappers would have called him mad, sitting alone in the wilderness drawing pictures. But Elias was solving a problem that had killed his partner, and he was beginning to see a solution that violated every convention of cabin construction he had ever known. Spring arrived in late March, and Elias left the mountains with his winter's take of pelts. The haul was smaller than it would have been with Martin's help, but it was sufficient to fund what he planned to do next. He sold the furs in Street Louis for a modest profit, but instead of spending the money on supplies for another trapping season, he spent it on education. He haunted construction sites throughout the city, watching builders work and asking questions that made him seem strange. He wanted to understand how buildings stayed warm. Most workers gave him vague answers about thick walls and good fireplaces, but a few understood the principles he was asking about. One carpenter explained that air spaces between walls provided better insulation than solid mass. Another mentioned that layered construction, with gaps, retained heat more effectively than single thick barriers. Elias spent 2 weeks studying a warehouse being built near the riverfront. The structure had double walls with a 6-inch gap between them. The builder explained that the airspace prevented cold from penetrating to the interior during winter and kept heat out during summer. The still air acted as a barrier because air itself conducted temperature poorly when it was trapped and motionless. Moving air carried heat away. Trapped air preserved it. He examined root cellars dug into hillsides, noting how multiple chambers kept vegetables from freezing even during harsh winters. The chambers were not heated, but the layered spaces of still air between the outside cold and the stored food created enough insulation to prevent freezing. He studied clothing, realizing that layered garments worked better than single thick coats because the air trapped between layers provided the real insulation. The principle was consistent across every application he examined. Trapped air was an excellent insulator. Multiple layers of trapped air were even better. The thickness of walls mattered less than the number of air spaces they created. A thin wall with an air gap outperformed a thick, solid wall in thermal retention. Elias began sketching designs for a cabin that would incorporate these principles. His first attempts were crude, showing double walls with air spaces. But as he refined his thinking, he realized that walls were only part of the problem. The roof was where most heat escaped. Warm air rose naturally, and in his old cabin, it rose straight through the roof into the atmosphere. What if he could create multiple air chambers in the roof system? The idea of layered roofs emerged slowly. At first, he envisioned 2 roofs with an air space between them. Then he considered 3, stacked with gaps. The more he thought about it, the more logical it seemed to maximize the layers. Each additional roof would create another chamber of trapped air. Each chamber would add insulation. The effect would compound. By the time he left Street Louis in late May, Elias had sketched plans for a cabin with 5 separate roof tiers. Each roof would be offset from the one below it, creating air chambers that would trap rising heat. The design looked absurd on paper, like a pyramid or a pagoda, but the physics were sound. If each air chamber added 12 degrees of thermal retention based on his calculations, 5 roofs would create a 48-degree difference between interior warmth and exterior cold. Elias returned to the mountains in early June of 1838 with unusual supplies and specific plans. He passed through several trapper camps on his way back to his territory, and at each stop, men asked what he intended to do. When he explained his plan to build a cabin with 5 layered roofs, the reactions ranged from confusion to outright mockery. Owen Caldwell, a trapper who had established a camp about 8 miles from where Martin had died, listened to Elias's explanation and laughed openly. He said that Elias was wasting time and resources on foolishness. 1 good roof was enough for any man. Building 5 roofs would take months and consume timber that could be used for firewood. The whole idea was the product of grief and isolation, driving a man to madness. Other trappers were less direct but equally skeptical. They pointed out that mountain men had been building single-roof cabins for decades. If multiple roofs were necessary, someone would have discovered it already. The fact that no one built cabins that way proved it was unnecessary. Elias was overthinking a simple problem. He should build a normal cabin, trap beaver, and stop obsessing over his dead partner's fate. Elias did not argue with them. He simply said he was building the cabin for himself, and if it failed, the loss would be his alone. But he knew the design would work. He had seen the principles demonstrated in buildings, root cellars, and bird nests. Trapped air insulated. Layered air spaces compounded the effect. The mockery did not change the physics. He returned to his territory and selected a new cabin site. The location he chose was on high ground, about a quarter-mile from where the old cabin still stood. He wanted clear sight lines, good drainage, and a position that would allow the layered roof design to shed snow effectively. The site had a slight elevation advantage that would help with the tiered roof construction. Elias spent the first week clearing the site and preparing materials. He cut timber selectively, choosing straight logs of consistent diameter. He gathered stones for the foundation and chimney. He sketched the final design in the dirt, calculating dimensions and angles for each roof tier. The work was methodical and precise. Owen Caldwell visited the site in late June and watched Elias laying out the foundation. He asked if Elias was truly committed to building 5 roofs on one cabin. Elias confirmed that he was. Owen shook his head and said the other trappers were taking bets on how long before Elias abandoned the project and built something sensible. The consensus was that he would give up after finishing the second roof and realizing how much work remained. Elias said nothing. He drove stakes into the ground, marking the footprint of each roof tier. The pattern looked bizarre, 5 concentric rectangles of decreasing size stacked in his plans. Owen rode away laughing, already composing the story he would tell other trappers about Thornwell's madness. The foundation work began in early July and took 2 full weeks to complete. Elias was not building a simple cabin, and he could not afford to have the structure settle or shift. He dug a trench around the entire perimeter of the main living space, 18 inches deep and filled with carefully selected stones. The stone foundation would distribute weight evenly and prevent the logs from sitting directly on ground that would freeze and heave during winter. Above the stone foundation, he laid the first course of logs. These were the largest and straightest logs he had cut, each one stripped of bark and shaped to create consistent contact surfaces. He had spent days preparing these logs, using a draw knife to smooth irregularities and create flat, upper and lower surfaces that would stack tightly. The gaps between logs were minimal, far tighter than standard cabin construction. For chinking, Elias rejected the traditional moss and mud mixture. Instead, he prepared a compound using clay from a creek bank, mixed with pine pitch he had harvested and boiled down, and horsehair he had collected from wild horses that ranged through the territory. The mixture was labor-intensive to prepare, but it created a seal that was waterproof, flexible, and far more durable than moss. The walls rose slowly through July. Elias worked alone, cutting and fitting each log with obsessive precision. At the corners, he used a modified dovetail joint that interlocked tightly and distributed weight across multiple connection points. The corner construction was stronger than necessary for a single-story structure, but Elias was building for a roof system that would create substantial weight. Owen Caldwell visited again in early August and found Elias working on the door frame. The walls were complete, rising 8 feet above the foundation. Owen asked about the roof, expecting to see standard construction beginning. Instead, Elias explained that he would be building the first roof tier to cover the main living space, then building 4 additional tiers above it, each one smaller than the one below. Owen asked how the air spaces between roofs would help. Elias explained the physics as simply as he could. Air was a poor conductor of heat. When air was trapped in a confined space and could not circulate, it became an insulator. Each roof would trap a layer of still air. Warm air from the cabin would rise and be caught in the first air chamber. Some heat would escape to the second chamber, but the air there would also be warmer than the outside. The effect would stack, creating multiple thermal barriers. Owen listened, then asked why Elias did not just build thicker walls if insulation was the goal. Elias explained that heat rose, and walls did nothing to stop heat from escaping through the roof. The roof was where most heat loss occurred in any cabin. Trapping that rising heat in multiple chambers was more effective than any amount of wall insulation. Owen remained skeptical, but admitted the logic was interesting. He said he would wait to see if the construction actually worked before passing final judgment. Then he added that most trappers still thought Elias was wasting an entire summer building an elaborate monument to a dead man's memory. The first roof tier went up in mid-August, and it was unlike any roof construction Owen or the other visiting trappers had seen. Elias began with heavy ridge poles spanning the width of the cabin, each one notched to sit securely on the top wall logs. He selected logs 8 inches in diameter for these structural members, far heavier than necessary for a standard roof. The spacing was tight, only 16 inches between each ridge pole. Across these ridge poles, he laid split planks that he had hewn flat on one side. The planks overlapped like shingles, each layer covering the gaps in the layer below. He pegged each plank to the ridge poles, using wooden dowels he had whittled during evening hours. The pegging pattern was precise, creating a rigid structure that would not shift or separate under snow load. Over the planks, Elias laid multiple layers of birch bark. Birch bark was naturally waterproof and flexible, perfect for creating a seal against rain and snow. He overlapped the bark sheets carefully, ensuring that water would run down and off without finding gaps to penetrate. Over the bark, he applied his clay and pine pitch mixture, sealing every potential leak point. The final layer was living sod. Elias cut sections of prairie grass with their root systems intact and laid them over the sealed roof. The sod would root and grow, creating a living roof that provided additional insulation and weight. The grass would shed snow gradually and help regulate temperature through the growing season. The total thickness of the first roof was nearly 10 inches of layered materials. But Elias did not stop there. The first roof extended 18 inches beyond the cabin walls on all sides, creating an overhang that would protect the walls from rain and provide the foundation for the next tier. At the outer edge of this overhang, he installed vertical posts, each one 8 feet tall and securely anchored to the roof structure below. These posts would support the second roof tier. The posts were spaced 6 feet apart around the entire perimeter. Between the posts, he installed horizontal beams, creating a framework that formed a rectangle smaller than the first roof, but following the same shape. This framework sat 8 feet above the first roof, creating an air chamber with precise dimensions. The chamber was tall enough for air to circulate vertically, but enclosed enough to prevent wind from flowing through. Owen visited while Elias was installing the support posts and asked what possible purpose they served. Elias explained that the posts created the air gap between the first and second roof tiers. The gap needed to be substantial enough to trap a significant volume of air, but not so large that the air could circulate freely and carry heat away. Owen watched the work with growing fascination, despite his skepticism. The construction was elaborate and time-consuming, but it was also precisely engineered. Every element served a specific purpose in Elias's thermal retention system. The mockery was beginning to shift toward reluctant curiosity. The second roof tier began in early September and followed the same construction pattern as the first. Ridge poles, split planks, birch bark, clay seal, and living sod. But this roof was smaller, following the rectangle defined by the support posts. It extended 12 inches beyond those posts, creating another overhang that would support the third tier's framework. The work was exhausting. Elias was building at height now, working on scaffolding he had constructed from pine poles lashed together with rawhide. Every log, every plank, every bucket of clay mixture had to be hauled up to the working level. The physical effort was substantial, but Elias worked with methodical determination, refusing to rush or cut corners. The third-tier framework went up in late September. More vertical posts, 8 feet tall, rising from the second roof's overhang. More horizontal beams creating a rectangle smaller than the second tier. Another air chamber taking shape, this one 16 feet above the main cabin's living space. The structure was beginning to look bizarre, a stepped pyramid rising from the forest floor. Other trappers began making special trips to see Thornwell's madness. Men rode for a day just to witness the strange construction. They gathered in small groups at a distance and pointed at the rising tiers. Some laughed openly. Others shook their heads in disbelief. A few asked Elias questions about the design, receiving patient explanations about trapped air and thermal retention that seemed like lunatic ravings. The nickname emerged during this period. Trappers started calling it Thornwell's Pagoda, referencing the tiered Asian temples that some had seen in drawings or descriptions from sailors. The name was meant to be derisive, emphasizing how foreign and ridiculous the design appeared in the Montana wilderness. Elias heard the nickname and did not object. He was not building for aesthetics or community approval. The third roof went on in early October, following the established pattern. Ridge poles, planks, bark, seal, sod. The structure was 24 feet tall now, measured from foundation to the top of the third tier. It dominated the landscape, visible from a considerable distance. It looked like nothing else in the territory. Elias worked faster as autumn temperatures dropped. He needed to complete the final 2 tiers before winter made construction impossible. The 4th tier framework went up in mid-October, following the same engineering as the previous levels. Vertical posts, horizontal beams, another air chamber. The rectangle was smaller now, the structure narrowing as it climbed. Owen visited in late October and found Elias working on the 4th roof. The temperature was dropping toward freezing at night, and Owen asked if Elias would finish before winter. Elias said he would. Owen asked if the cabin would work, if the multiple roofs would actually trap heat the way Elias claimed. Elias said he would know soon enough. If the design failed, he would freeze, just as Martin had. If it worked, Owen and the others would see the proof firsthand. The 4th roof was completed in early November, just as the first serious snows began falling. Elias worked through light snowfall to install the final layers of birch bark and clay seal. The sod layer would have to wait until spring, but the roof was weatherproof and functional. The 4th air chamber was complete, and the structure now stood 32 feet tall. The 5th and final tier was the smallest and most critical. The framework consisted of 4 corner posts rising 8 feet from the 4th roof, supporting a small rectangular cap that would house the chimney penetration. This final air chamber would be directly above the stovepipe, capturing the last rising heat before it escaped to the atmosphere. Elias built the chimney through all 5 roof tiers simultaneously. He had stockpiled stones throughout the construction process specifically for this purpose. The chimney rose from the fireplace through the main living space, penetrated the 1st roof, continued through the 1st air chamber, penetrated the 2nd roof, and climbed through each successive chamber until it emerged above the 5th tier. The chimney construction was delicate work. Each roof penetration had to be sealed perfectly to prevent leaks while allowing the stone chimney to pass through. Elias used his clay mixture liberally around each penetration point, creating flexible seals that would accommodate minor settling. The chimney warmed all 5 air chambers as smoke and heat rose through it, adding to the thermal retention effect. The 5th roof went on in mid-November. It was the smallest tier, covering only the area around the chimney and the support posts. But it completed the system. 5 roofs, 4 air chambers, and a chimney warming each level. The structure was finished. Owen Caldwell arrived the day after completion with 3 other trappers. They stood in the clearing staring at the bizarre pyramid that Elias had built. The structure was unlike anything they had seen. 5 distinct roof levels stepped up from a base cabin, each tier smaller than the one below, the whole thing capped by a stone chimney rising from the peak. It looked impossible, absurd, and strangely magnificent. One of the trappers asked how long the construction had taken. Elias said, 5 months working alone. The trapper laughed and said, a normal cabin took 5 days with 2 men. Elias had wasted an entire trapping season building an elaborate shelter when he could have been making money. Owen asked the question the others were thinking. Would it work? Would the 5 roofs actually keep Elias warmer than a normal cabin? Elias said they would know by spring. If he survived the winter, burning normal amounts of firewood and maintaining comfortable temperatures, the design worked. If he froze despite the elaborate construction, the skeptics would be proven right. The trappers left shaking their heads. Bets were placed throughout the scattered camps. Most predicted Elias would abandon the bizarre structure by January and build a normal cabin when he realized the 5 roofs made no practical difference. Elias moved into the completed cabin in late November of 1838 and began his experiment. He had 5 thermometers, purchased in St. Louis specifically for this purpose. He placed one in the main living space, one in each of the 4 air chambers, accessible through small hatches he had built into the roof tiers, and kept detailed records of temperature readings. The fireplace in the main living space was modest, built for efficiency rather than maximum heat output. Elias wanted to know how little fire was necessary to maintain comfortable temperatures with the 5-tier roof system. He started with a small fire, burning approximately 1/4 the wood he had burned in the old cabin during the previous winter. The results were immediate and dramatic. With a modest fire burning, the main living space stabilized at 62 degrees. The first air chamber, measured through its access hatch, showed 58 degrees. The second chamber registered 54 degrees. The third chamber held at 50 degrees. The fourth chamber, just below the fifth roof, maintained 46 degrees. Outside temperature was 18 degrees. The mathematics were clear. Each air chamber was trapping approximately 4 degrees of temperature differential. The effect was compounding as heat rose through the system. The total difference between interior warmth and exterior cold was 44 degrees, achieved with a fire that was consuming minimal wood. Elias increased the fire slightly over the following days, experimenting with different burning rates. He discovered that with a moderate fire, the kind that required feeding every 2 hours rather than every 30 minutes, he could maintain the main living space at 68 degrees. The air chambers above showed progressive temperatures stepping down toward the outside cold, but even the fourth chamber stayed well above freezing. The system worked exactly as he had calculated. Each roof tier was trapping rising heat in its air chamber. The trapped air was not circulating enough to carry heat away, so it accumulated warmth. The progressive layers created a thermal gradient from the warm interior to the cold exterior, with each layer acting as an insulating barrier. December brought colder temperatures, and Elias continued his measurements. When outside temperatures dropped to zero, the main living space required a slightly larger fire, but still maintained 65 degrees comfortably. The air chambers showed their progressive temperatures, proving that heat was being trapped rather than escaping directly through the roof system. Owen visited in mid-December and asked to see the inside. Elias welcomed him in. Owen entered expecting to feel the same desperate cold he experienced in his own cabin. Instead, he found comfortable warmth. He could remove his heavy coat. The interior felt like a room in a Street Louis building, not a frontier cabin in Montana winter. Elias showed Owen the thermometers and explained the temperature readings in each chamber. Owen studied the numbers with growing amazement. He asked how much wood Elias was burning. Elias estimated he was using approximately 1/3 the wood he had burned in the old cabin. January of 1840 brought temperatures that trappers across the territory would remember for decades. A massive Arctic storm moved south through the Rockies in the second week of the month, driving temperatures to levels that had not been recorded in living memory. The cold arrived suddenly on January 9th, dropping from 20 below to 45 below zero in a single day. By January 11th, temperatures had fallen to 58 below zero. The storm lasted 9 days. Wind howled through the mountains, driving snow horizontally and creating drifts 15 feet deep in sheltered areas. The cold was so severe that exposed skin froze in minutes. Trees cracked and exploded from frozen sap, expanding inside their trunks. Wildlife died in their dens. Trappers huddled in their cabins, burning everything combustible, fighting desperately to stay alive. Owen Caldwell's cabin, 8 miles from Elias's location, became a battle zone against the cold. Owen burned wood constantly, feeding his fireplace every 15 minutes. He burned his extra furniture, his spare snowshoes, even planks torn from his interior walls. The fire roared, consuming fuel at an unsustainable rate, but the cabin's interior temperature dropped steadily. By the third day of extreme cold, ice was forming on the interior walls despite the flames. Jacob Hensley, a trapper with a camp 12 miles to the north, fared even worse. His cabin was standard construction, built quickly the previous summer. The cold penetrated through every gap in the chinked logs. His fireplace could not keep pace with heat loss. By the 5th day of the storm, his water was frozen solid inside the cabin. He wrapped himself in every fur he owned and burned his door for fuel, knowing he was fighting a losing battle. Thomas Brennan, camped 15 miles west, abandoned his cabin on the 6th day. The structure was uninhabitable despite burning furniture and equipment. He loaded his 2 horses with essential supplies and attempted to ride to a trading post 40 miles away. He nearly died in the attempt, suffering severe frostbite before finding shelter in a cave system where geothermal heat kept temperatures barely survivable. Across the territory, trappers were burning through their winter wood supplies at catastrophic rates, destroying their own cabins for fuel and accepting that they might not survive until the storm broke. Standard cabin construction, adequate for normal winters, was failing completely against the extreme cold. Men were dying inside structures specifically built to protect them from winter weather. Elias Thornwell sat in his 5-tiered cabin in his shirt sleeves. The interior temperature was 68 degrees. He was burning wood at a moderate rate, feeding his fireplace every 90 minutes. The fire was substantial but not extreme. He was consuming approximately 40% of his winter wood supply to maintain comfortable warmth, a sustainable rate that would last through spring without difficulty. The 5 roof tiers were performing beyond his calculations. Each air chamber was trapping heat so effectively that the compounding insulation was creating a temperature differential of more than 50 degrees between the main living space and the exterior. The trapped air was not circulating, not carrying heat away, simply holding warmth in progressive layers that prevented the brutal cold from penetrating to the interior. On January 15th, the 5th day of extreme cold, Elias took temperature readings that would later be recorded in his journals as proof of his design's effectiveness. Outside temperature was 56 below zero. The 4th air chamber, measured through its access hatch, registered 42 degrees. The 3rd chamber showed 48 degrees. The 2nd chamber held at 54 degrees. The 1st chamber registered 60 degrees. The main living space was a comfortable 68 degrees. The total temperature differential was 124 degrees from outside to inside. Elias was maintaining summer comfort in the worst winter storm anyone in the territory had experienced. He was doing this while burning less wood than trappers in standard cabins were burning to maintain barely survivable temperatures. The 5-tier roof system had transformed the physics of frontier shelter. Elias stood at his window watching the storm rage outside. He could see his breath when he stood close to the glass, the only cold spot in the cabin. The log's walls were warm to the touch on the interior. The floor, raised slightly above ground level on the stone foundation, was comfortable for bare feet. The fireplace radiated steady heat that rose and was captured in the layered air chambers above, prevented from escaping into the atmosphere. He thought about Martin, dead nearly 3 years now, killed by cold inside a cabin that should have protected him. This structure, this bizarre pyramid of 5 roofs that everyone had mocked, was the solution to the problem that had taken his partner's life. If Martin had died in this cabin, with this design, Elias would know he had done everything possible. But Martin had died in a standard cabin, killed by conventional construction's inadequacy. The storm continued through January 16th and 17th. Elias maintained his routine, checking temperatures, feeding the fire at regular intervals, and recording observations. He ate hot meals cooked on the fireplace. He slept comfortably under a single blanket. He read by firelight and worked on equipment repairs in warmth that would have seemed impossible to anyone else in the territory. On January 18th, Owen Caldwell appeared at Elias's door. Owen was frost-covered, exhausted, and desperate. His cabin had become uninhabitable. Despite burning everything he could tear apart, the interior temperature had dropped to 15 degrees. He was certain he would die if he stayed there another night. He had ridden 8 miles through the storm to reach Elias's bizarre pyramid, gambling that the strange design might actually work. Elias opened the door, and warm air rushed out into the frozen landscape. Owen stumbled inside, ice breaking off his beard and eyebrows. He stood in the entry staring at the warm interior, at Elias standing in his shirt sleeves, at the modest fire burning in the fireplace. The temperature difference was so extreme that Owen's frost-covered clothing began steaming as it thawed. Owen asked how this was possible. His own fireplace was consuming wood at triple the rate of Elias's fire, and his cabin was barely above freezing. Elias's cabin was warm as a summer day, with a fire that looked almost casual. Owen stayed through the night of January 18th. experiencing warmth he had thought impossible during the storm. He slept on Elias's floor, wrapped in a single blanket, and woke sweating from the comfortable heat. In the morning, he asked detailed questions about the roof construction, wanting to understand how the 5 tiers created such dramatic thermal retention. Elias explained the air chamber system patiently, showing Owen the access hatches and letting him feel the progressive temperatures in each layer. On January 19th, Jacob Hensley arrived with his wife and 2 children. Jacob's family had been with him at his camp, and all 4 were suffering from severe cold exposure. His cabin had become a death trap. The children were showing dangerous symptoms of hypothermia despite being wrapped in furs and huddled around a fire that was consuming the cabin's own structural logs. Jacob had loaded his family on a sled and traveled 12 miles through the storm, following descriptions he had heard of Thornwell's location. Elias took them in without hesitation. The cabin was crowded with 6 people, but it remained warm. The fire needed feeding more frequently with additional occupants, but the 5-tier roof system handled the increased heat load easily. Jacob's children recovered within hours, their body temperatures normalizing in the sustained warmth. Jacob's wife cried with relief, having believed they would all die before the storm broke. Thomas Brennan arrived on January 20th, having abandoned his cave shelter, when he heard from another trapper that Elias's bizarre pyramid cabin was somehow maintaining livable temperatures. Thomas had severe frostbite on 3 fingers and was weak from days of inadequate food and brutal cold exposure. Elias treated his injuries and gave him warm food and a place to sleep. The cabin housed 7 people through the final days of the storm. It was cramped and privacy was non-existent, but everyone was warm and safe. The fire burned constantly, consuming more wood than Elias had planned, but still at a sustainable rate. The 5 roof tiers trapped enough heat to keep the interior comfortable despite the crowding and the brutal cold outside. The storm finally broke on January 22nd. Temperatures rose to 20 below zero, which felt almost warm after the extreme cold. The survivors in Elias's cabin ventured outside, stunned to have made it through alive. They looked at the 5-tiered structure with new eyes, seeing not an absurd monument to madness, but a piece of engineering that had saved their lives. Owen, Jacob, and Thomas stayed an additional 2 days, helping Elias replenish his wood supply and listening to detailed explanations of the construction techniques. All 3 asked permission to build similar structures. Elias shared his knowledge freely, explaining the support post spacing, the air chamber dimensions, the chimney routing, and the materials he had used for sealing and insulation. Word spread rapidly through the surviving trappers. The storm had killed 11 men across the territory, all of them dying in standard cabins that could not maintain survivable temperatures. But 7 people had survived in Thornwell's 5-tiered pyramid, comfortable and safe, while others froze to death miles away. Spring of 1840 brought a fundamental shift in how trappers viewed cabin construction. The men who had survived in Elias's structure during the January storm became evangelists for the 5-tier roof design. Owen Caldwell began building his new cabin in April, following Elias's specifications precisely. He spent 3 months on construction, investing time he would normally have used for trapping because staying alive had become more important than maximizing short-term profit. Jacob Hensley built his new structure near his old cabin site, which he dismantled for materials. He modified Elias's design slightly, using 4 roof tiers instead of 5 because his family needed more interior space, and he calculated that 4 air chambers would provide adequate insulation for his needs. His construction took 2 months with his wife helping, and the finished cabin showed the same stepped pyramid profile that had seemed so absurd the previous year. Thomas Brennan built the most elaborate version, adding a loft space within the main structure and incorporating 6 roof tiers. His construction took 4 months and consumed enormous amounts of timber, but Thomas had nearly died in the January storm and was determined to build the most thermally efficient shelter in the territory. His finished cabin stood 40 feet tall and became a landmark visible for miles. Other trappers who had not experienced the storm firsthand remained skeptical initially, but curiosity drove them to examine the new construction. They asked questions, studied the air chamber systems, and listened to detailed explanations from the converts. The physics were undeniable. Trapped air, insulated, multiple layers compounded the effect. The five-tier design transformed cabin heating from a constant battle against heat loss to a managed system that preserved warmth. By summer of 1840, 12 trappers were building multi-tiered roof cabins across the northern Montana Territory. Each builder adapted Elias's basic design to their specific needs and available materials. Some built 4 tiers, some built 5. One ambitious builder attempted 7. The details varied, but the principle remained consistent. Multiple roofs, creating multiple air chambers, provided superior thermal retention compared to any single roof design. The construction technique acquired a name through organic use rather than formal designation. Trappers referred to the designs as Thornwell structures or Thornwell roofs. Elias never claimed credit or tried to control the terminology. He simply answered questions and helped other builders understand the principles. His goal had been survival, not recognition, and he was satisfied seeing men build shelters that would keep them alive. The practical advantages extended beyond cold weather survival. The multi-tier roofs shed snow more effectively than flat or gabled designs. The air chambers provided insulation against summer heat, keeping interiors cooler during hot months. The robust construction using support posts and layered roofs created structures that were extraordinarily durable, resistant to wind damage, and capable of supporting heavy snow loads without stress. The multi-tiered roof design spread beyond the immediate trapping community through the natural movement of men across the frontier. Trappers who had built Thornwell structures talked about them at trading posts and rendezvous gatherings. Word reached settlements along the Missouri River by late 1840. By 1841, homesteaders moving into the Northern Territories were hearing stories about revolutionary cabin designs that could maintain summer warmth during Arctic winter storms. A missionary named Reverend Samuel Hutchins encountered a Thornwell structure in the summer of 1841 while traveling through Montana. He spent 2 days with Thomas Brennan, examining the 6-tiered roof system and listening to accounts of the January 1840 storm. Hutchins recognized the design's potential for mission buildings in remote northern locations where maintaining warmth was critical for survival and for attracting native populations to services during winter months. Hutchins built the first mission using a modified Thornwell design in 1842 near what would later become Helena, Montana. His structure incorporated 5 roof tiers over a larger rectangular building designed to house 30 people during services. The construction took 7 months with help from converted native builders who contributed traditional weatherproofing techniques that enhanced the air chamber ceiling. The finished mission became a shelter during severe weather, saving lives during multiple winter storms over the following decade. Military engineers encountered the design in 1843 when surveying routes for potential frontier forts. A lieutenant named William Patterson visited Owen Caldwell's rebuilt cabin and filed a detailed report describing the multi-tiered roof construction and its thermal efficiency. The report recommended that frontier military outposts in extreme northern climates consider incorporating similar designs for barracks and critical supply storage buildings where maintaining stable temperatures was operationally important. The United States Army built 3 experimental structures using Thornwell principles between 1844 and 1846. The structures were built at Fort Benton in Montana, Fort Union in North Dakota, and a remote outpost in northern Wyoming. All 3 used 4-tiered roof systems over rectangular barracks buildings. The military versions incorporated modifications for larger structures, including interior support columns and reinforced framework, but the core principle of multiple air chambers remained central to the design. Trading post operators adopted the technique for storing temperature-sensitive goods. A trader named Marcus Whitley built a 5-tiered storage building in 1845 specifically to house furs, medicines, and other materials that degraded in extreme temperature fluctuations. The stable interior temperature maintained by the air chamber system reduced spoilage and preserved inventory quality. Other traders observed the advantage and began building similar structures at posts throughout the northern Rockies and upper Missouri River regions. By 1847, approximately 60 structures incorporating multi-tiered roof designs existed across Montana, Wyoming, and Dakota territories. The number would triple over the following 5 years as the technique became standard practice for anyone building in regions where winter temperatures regularly dropped below zero. The design had evolved from one man's obsessive response to personal tragedy into an accepted architectural solution for extreme climate shelter, spread entirely through organic adoption by people who needed what it provided: reliable protection against cold that could kill. The scientific principles underlying the multi-tiered roof system were straightforward, though few builders in the 1840s would have articulated them in formal terms. Heat transfer occurred through 3 mechanisms: conduction, convection, and radiation. Standard cabin construction failed to address all 3 mechanisms adequately. The Thornwell design succeeded by systematically blocking each heat transfer pathway through layered barriers and trapped air. Conduction was heat transfer through direct contact between materials. In a standard cabin, heat conducted from the warm interior air through the roof materials to the cold exterior. Wood conducted heat moderately well, meaning a solid wooden roof allowed steady heat loss through direct transfer. The multi-tiered system interrupted conduction by separating roof layers with air gaps. Air conducted heat extremely poorly, approximately 25 times less efficiently than wood. Each air chamber created a conductive barrier that dramatically slowed heat transfer from warm interior to cold exterior. Convection was heat transfer through air movement. Warm air rose naturally, and in standard cabins, that warm air rose directly to the roof and escaped through gaps or conducted through the roofing materials. The Thornwell design trapped rising warm air in the first air chamber. Some heat from that chamber rose to the second chamber, but the air there was already warmer than exterior temperature, reducing the temperature gradient, driving heat loss. Each successive chamber reduced the gradient further, creating a stepped transition from interior warmth to exterior cold, rather than a direct pathway for heat escape. Radiation was heat transfer through electromagnetic waves. All objects radiated heat proportional to their temperature. A warm cabin roof radiated heat to the cold night sky, losing energy continuously. The multi-tiered design addressed radiation by creating multiple radiating surfaces. The first roof radiated heat upward, but that heat was absorbed by the air in the first chamber and the underside of the second roof. The second roof radiated to the second chamber and third roof. The progressive absorption meant that exterior surfaces were much cooler than interior surfaces, reducing radiative heat loss to the environment substantially. The mathematical relationship was exponential rather than linear. A single roof with an air gap provided modest improvement over solid construction. 2 roofs with 2 air chambers provided more than double the improvement. 5 roofs with 4 air chambers provided thermal retention that was roughly 12 times better than single roof construction, assuming equivalent materials and construction quality. The effect compounded because each layer reduced heat loss, meaning less heat reached the next layer, creating a cascade of increasing efficiency. Temperature measurements from Elias's original cabin during normal winter conditions showed the progression clearly. With exterior temperature at 0 degrees and interior at 68 degrees, the air chambers showed 61, 54, 47, and 40 degrees respectively. Each chamber was progressively cooler, moving toward the exterior, demonstrating the stepped thermal gradient. The total insulating effect allowed a modest fire to maintain comfortable interior warmth, while standard cabins required enormous fires to achieve barely adequate temperatures under identical conditions. The durability advantage was equally significant. Standard cabins settled and deteriorated as logs compressed, dried, and shifted. The support post framework in Thornwell structures distributed weight across multiple points and prevented sagging that opened gaps in roof and wall joints. Elias Thornwell left the mountains in 1844 as the Rocky Mountain fur trade collapsed from depleted beaver populations and changing fashion demands in eastern markets. He had accumulated modest savings from his trapping years and invested them in land in the Oregon Territory, where reports of fertile valleys and mild climate attracted settlers seeking agricultural opportunities rather than wilderness extraction. He traveled west with a small wagon train, leaving behind the cabin that had proven his design's worth and saved multiple lives during the brutal winter of 1840. He married in 1846 a woman named Sarah Brennan, sister to Thomas Brennan, who had survived the January storm in Elias's cabin. They established a small ranch in the Willamette Valley, raising cattle and growing wheat. Elias never returned to Montana and rarely spoke of his trapping years. To his neighbors in Oregon, he was simply a quiet rancher who had come west like thousands of others, seeking land and stability. Elias and Sarah had 4 children between 1847 and 1855. He taught them farming, basic carpentry, and the value of methodical work done properly. He did not tell them about the 5-tiered cabin or the winter storm that had validated his design. His mountain years seemed like a different life, disconnected from the peaceful routine of farm work and family. In the Montana and Wyoming territories, the structures Elias had inspired continued functioning long after their builder had moved on. His original cabin stood until 1863, when a forest fire destroyed it, along with several square miles of timber. But by then, dozens of other multi-tiered roof structures existed across the region. Some housed trappers and hunters, others sheltered homesteading families. Trading posts, mission buildings, and military outposts incorporated the design principles. The technique had become part of frontier construction knowledge, passed from builder to builder without formal documentation or attribution. Elias Thornwell died in 1869 at age 63. He suffered a stroke while working in his barn and passed away 3 days later, surrounded by his family. He was buried in a small cemetery outside Salem, Oregon. His gravestone bore his name, birth, and death years, and the simple inscription, "Beloved husband and father." No mention was made of his time in the mountains, the cabin he had built, or the lives his innovation had saved. In the mountains he had left behind, structures built using his principles sheltered new generations. Some builders knew the technique had originated with a trapper named Thornwell decades earlier. Others simply knew that multi-tiered roofs worked better than single roofs in extreme cold and built accordingly. The knowledge persisted because it solved real problems, not because anyone promoted it or because Elias had sought recognition. The story of Elias Thornwell demonstrates that frontier innovation often came from necessity, confronting tragedy, rather than theoretical inquiry seeking advancement. A man watched his partner freeze to death in a cabin built using standard methods. That experience drove him to question conventional construction and seek better solutions using basic physics principles and careful observation. His solution required no new technology, no materials unavailable to any other builder, just existing resources used with exceptional thought and precision. The multi-tiered roof design spread across the northern frontier occurred organically because people who faced extreme cold recognized value when they saw it demonstrated. No marketing campaign promoted the design. No patent restricted its use. The technique simply worked, and people who needed it adopted it freely.